Hello, everyone. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I am, of course, Chris Weave. I do not have Pat Doyle with me, but I do have Rob Davidoff and TJ Zazadlo. Sorry, TJ. I always trip over that.
Everybody does.
Everybody does. And, I'm trying to be more sensitive about that because my last name is pronounced Weave, but it's got a damn U in it. So I'm used to just people getting stuff wrong.
Yeah.
Lissa knows this, at least I assume that she knows this, but the rest of you don't. I'm going to let you all in a little secret, and that is that when Lissa plays the countdown music, I'm usually sitting here doing this the entire time. So it's the only time I really chair dance, and that's what I do. Wright asks a very important question. Wright asks the question: are any of you speaking for your employers? As it turns out, I'm not speaking for my employer either. We may come back to this question later on in the show just to make sure that we've got that all down. So,
also, yes, can confirm he does chair.
So, Pat is not here tonight because Pat is teaching pilots how to fly the simulator. Well, actually, that's not quite an accurate description of what he's doing, but Pat is at his job, and he's running the simulator tonight with some pilots and stuff because part of Pat's job is that he ends up doing all this weird stuff. We end up doing stuff at weird hours because the simulator is a really expensive piece of gear. So basically, they try to have it scheduled, with the exception of the handful of times where they're doing like maintenance and upgrades and stuff like that. They try to basically run it 24/7. And so he frequently gets to do things like go to the office at 2 o'clock in the morning to run people through the simulator between 2 and 8 a.m. So he didn't have to do that tonight, but he's actually probably home right now, frantically packing because he's getting on an airplane, not as a pilot, so he can sleep tomorrow. He's getting on an airplane very early in the morning to fly off to do Navy stuff for a couple of weeks. So let's see. What have you guys been up to this week? What's going on with you? TJ, let's start with you. What have you been up to since the last time we saw you?
Copy editing work.
Usual.
Yeah.
How about you, Rob? Anything special going on with you?
Well, the main thing I've been doing is getting ready for next week when I'm going on some vacation. And so it's like this short 3-day week before I go on vacation. And then we got a call from the contractor for our house who asked if they could go ahead and move up our insulation appointment to have our 150-year-old house re-insulated to the 2 days before we go on vacation. So... And it's been cold enough. I said, sure, let's just get it done. But it does mean you never realize how much furniture you have in your house until you have to get it 4 feet away from every wall.
I could not do that. I mean, I literally could not do that because if you look over my shoulder, you can see I Tetris stuff in pretty good. And there's a recurring theme whenever I go to move that it does not matter whether the movers send people to do an inventory of my house to try to get an idea. They always screw it up. Yeah. So they're not materially any better, any more accurate than just talking to me over the phone because they come in and they don't see bookcases. When I went to move to go work at the Naval War College, they came in, and I know exactly what they did. They said 1 couch, 1 love seat, a coffee table, a dining room table, 4 chairs, a bed, a dresser, and this other dresser thing. No problem. I had 40 bookcases, 40.
Yeah,
in that apartment. And they kept calling for reinforcements. By the time they finished packing, they had 7 people packing me up. So, that's how that works. But I'm right now I'm in a place that's actually too small, intentionally so, because I wanted to wake up every morning and say, damn it, I still live here. I need to move someplace. I need to go buy a house or something, and I need to go buy a house. So.
The DoD doesn't have you integrating our gray allies with the Pentagon procurement processes. Boy, that sounds like an episode of Stargate.
It does. And one of the things that's interesting is if you've ever really sort of deep dived into the wackadoodle UFO lore, the Greys usually aren't our allies. The Greys are usually the bad guys.
Yeah.
7 days.
Yeah. There's
Anybody who remembers that show.
I'm sorry, you know?
7 days on UPN, late 90s science fiction.
No, this is the one with the time machine that could send them back 7 days in time.
Yeah.
I never saw it.
Probably for the best.
It was an interesting idea, but I never saw it. So interesting. I do have a copy of Odyssey 5, which was a short-lived TV show where what's his name? RoboCop.
Donnie nails it. Yeah, it was 7 days had Don Franklin.
Okay. Yeah, and I can't think of the name of the actor who played RoboCop, but he was
Peter Weller.
Peter Weller. Peter Weller was the lead in Odyssey 5, and they were on a space shuttle, and they saw the Earth destroyed. And then next thing you know, they've been thrown back in time, and they're trying to figure out what happened. And it seemed like an interesting premise, so I bought the complete series on DVD, and I've never watched it. So, but Peter Weller is an interesting character. I like Peter Weller.
Dr. Weller.
Dr. Weller, yes, he has a doctorate in art history, and which he got after he did all the acting stuff. So
yep.
So, but he's an interesting guy. He's one of the handful of people that I might. Yeah, I always say that there's only a handful of people in Hollywood I'd like to meet, and he's actually one of them. It's probably it's under 10 people, and he's on the list. So. But oh well.
He was on Enterprise, Donnie. Demons Terror Prime, season 4 of Enterprise.
Okay.
He played a bad guy.
Yeah, lately he plays lots of bad guys.
He did it really well.
Yeah, and I'm on record. I'm not a big fan of the JJ verse, not at all. But which is ironic because I think the first movie had the single best line in the entire franchise, which was Pike saying to Kirk, your father was a starship captain for 12 minutes and saved 800 people. I challenge you to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And the second movie, I think, was the most important single question, I think, in the franchise, which is one of the things that we've talked about, which is what is the nature of Starfleet?
Mm-hmm.
And because that's something that Starfleet clearly wrestles with, or perhaps more accurately, the writers wrestle with. Actually, no, I'll go with Starfleet wrestles with it because.
Yeah.
So those of you who are longtime watchers of the show have heard me say a couple of times that Pat and I will frequently talk during the course of the week, and sometimes by the time we actually get on the show and talk about something, it usually starts off as, hey, we're having an interesting conversation. Let's do this again in front of the camera. And then we'll talk later about like, okay, yeah, I was going to talk about this stuff. What are you going to talk about? And then, so by the time we actually do it in front of the camera, we've actually had the conversation like 3 or 4 times. And so earlier, about, 45 minutes ago, half hour ago, however long it was, TJ and Rob and I are having a conversation about the nature of Starfleet and how that changes over time, et cetera, et cetera. And about some of the episodes that sort of highlight that, because Jean-Luc Picard early on clearly doesn't understand the idea that the phasers actually are weapons and that they can be used to do weapon stuff. You sort of get the impression that by the time he comes back from his little TDY as Locutus as Borg, and by the time he comes back from his other TDY with the Cardassians, that maybe he gets that now.
Mm-hmm.
In a way he didn't before. So, but that's something I think that's worth That's worth a dedicated episode just on the nature of Starfleet. I was also commenting to them that there's a YouTube channel called Lore Reloaded. Always worth listening to, even when I disagree with him. And he's done a multi-part series on how Starfleet has evolved over time. He describes the Defiant as what happens when you make Daddy mad.
Well, then you get into Chuck Sonnenberg's description of the Defiant, which I will not repeat here because it is distinctly not safe for work.
Okay, well, we're not speaking for our employers. So we got that going for us.
Cisco's attitude adjuster, basically. If someone needs an attitude adjustment, it's Cisco's here for adjusting attitudes.
Yes.
Yeah, Cisco is such a wonderful character, especially because he Cisco does a great job of showing that Jean-Luc Picard that all Starfleet officers aren't Jean-Luc Picard.
Well, that's actually a fantastic
segue into tonight's presentation.
Well, I figured that.
And Carlos, I will come back to your statement later if I can remember.
Okay. All right. So we've got, so those of you who were here last week will recall that TJ put together a presentation on the other captains, which he'll detail exactly what he means by that in just a second. And so if you haven't seen that first part, you can go back and do it. It's all the original series era, including the movies, captains. And now we're going to go into the TNG era. So with that in mind, let me click to add to screen. And over to you, TJ.
Thank you, Chris. So we are off with the other captains and what we can tell them and what that tells us about Starfleet. Standard boilerplate. I don't talk for anybody except myself, and even then I technically don't probably talk for myself. Bad takes are my responsibility. Good takes are random. I'm not your copy editor. I'm not my copy editor. I go by Arnie Holmes. All images are courtesy of Memory Alpha. So we're going to start in on TNG. And this is actually one of the really interesting points, I think, is that we go through almost the entire first season of TNG without seeing a single other captain until we get to the finale with Conspiracy.
And to be clear how we're defining that, we are defining that as a captain who is not basically a member of the show's opening titles. So if one of the crew gets a temporary promotion or something, that doesn't count. And if they're they're wearing captain's pips, but they're standing in a bar on a space station and they don't have a ship right now, that doesn't count. They have to have a ship, not a desk.
Thank you, Rob. Also, admirals taking command of the ship do not count. So our first one is Walter Keel of the Ambassador class Horatio. We don't see the Ambassador in this, but we get the name dropped. And we have it dropped as it is explicitly a heavy cruiser. And Keel is dealing with the discovery of the conspiracy in Starfleet. He's had his first officer replaced. I think his CMO is replaced too. And Keel and our next two captains both are interrogating Picard over is Picard still Picard, or has he been mind controlled? And Keel specifically has a long history with Picard, and having been, as I note on there, the one who introduced Beverly Howard to Jack Crusher. And Keel says that, gives that line to Beverly, and Beverly shows up on the Enterprise bridge later and is like, "Oh, I wish I'd have known we were around him. Did he say anything?" And Picard, knowing that Keel is dead, says no. So Picard is lying to Beverly to spare her the events. And the events of the conspiracy absolutely sound crazy. Somebody is mind controlling vast swaths of Starfleet, managing personnel decisions, replacing major crew members throughout the fleet. And Picard takes it seriously because of who is coming to him with this information, which implies that there are the interpersonal relationships exist, and captains who are out on the front lines take each other seriously even then. So even then, the writers have that in mind as they do this.
That's Conspiracy is a very interesting episode in Star Trek history, because I, for one, when Conspiracy happens, think, okay, they could run with this for a while, right?
Yeah, and they turn around and solve it in 40 minutes.
Yeah, but you'd think that's like, okay, so that's round one, and they're going to come back, right? And we never hear about it ever again, in part because the overwhelming reaction amongst everybody, except apparently me, was incredibly negative. Everybody hated this episode. They didn't like it. This is not what their vision of Star Trek was.
Yeah, it's much more like Animorphs.
Well, I was going to say Battlestar Galactica. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
More
that's
B5.
I'm sorry, what?
More Babylon 5. Sort of there.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I was thinking Battlestar Galactica from the standpoint of, they look just like us.
Yeah.
But all of it sort of fits into the idea of it's just not the show that people, even at the point, how do I want to say this?
It wasn't the show people were expecting.
Star Trek was always American space opera. And what I mean by that is, if you go back to like the Doc Smith tradition, right? American space opera is inherently optimistic. Even in Doc Smith, when they're using planets as kinetic kill vehicles, and by implication, potentially wiping out entire civilizations, it's still a do sort of happy background sort of thing, right? It's always very optimistic. That Star Trek has always sort of been that way, right? It's sort of it's a utopia that's not quite as utopian as it might look like. There are things wrong with the Federation. There are things that go wrong, but by and large, it's the sort of place you'd want to live. And this just didn't fit in with it. It just didn't fit in with that at all. It's not Warhammer 40K. I don't know anybody who would willingly say, yeah, that's the universe I want to live in. But I've often said to people, like, if it turns out that Star Trek was real and people and I could be teleported to the 24th century and go be a member of Starfleet, I'd miss you all. I really would. But I'd do it in a heartbeat. I wouldn't even look back.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, what's interesting is that with Conspiracy, we go 20-some episodes without having a single other captain that meets the criteria, and he isn't a corpse. I don't remember if there were any corpses in season 1. And we get 3 in a single episode. And we get Rix. And as far as I noted, Rix is the only Bolian captain we see. And he's sort of the gray Bolian skin, not the blue that most people think of later. And he had interactions. Again, it's noted that he had interaction with Picard prior to the events of the episode. And there's not a whole lot to be said, except that he's described as one of Starfleet's finest commanders.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the impression that he and Keel, it's their gravitas that brings Picard into the situation. And our third is Trilus Scott, commander of the Renegade. And it's said that she made captain faster than anyone in Starfleet history, present company included. First note, fastest does not mean youngest. there is the widely accepted view that Kirk was the youngest, except if you backdate with Picard, Picard probably beats Kirk by a couple of years into it when he takes command of Stargazer. That, however, doesn't distinguish between position of captain and rank.
Mm-hmm.
Sisko is captaining the Defiant as a commander, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if this is canonical or not, but I believe that Kirk was a commander during his time aboard the Enterprise for a bit.
Kirk has 06 grades.
He does? The entire time?
I believe so, yeah. You had this conversation with Pat before.
Yeah, you're right. I did. I was just remembering, but I couldn't remember how how it turned out. So,
right, but it also who made position of captain with Picard versus rank.
Yeah.
And yes, she has 4 pips in conspiracy, but did she? How long has she been a captain for? Picard. This is the one. Picard has no experience with her, which is why it's important that Keel and Rix are there. Then we move on into season 2 with Taggart aboard the Excelsior-class Repulse. We see very little about him except for the fact that they call him up to see if they have any of Pulaski's DNA on file after the genetic experimentation accident that results in the kids that age all the adults around them. That was a weird episode.
I have no memory of this episode, and I don't know if it's because what season was it?
Season 2.
Season 2.
It's entirely possible that I never managed to see all the season 2 episodes because I actually stopped watching Star Trek TNG, and then I was talked into giving it another try by the assistant manager at a Games Workshop store who said something about TNG, and I said, yeah, piece of shit. And he goes, no, it got good. And I said, when I watched it, was a piece of shit. And he said, it was for 2 years, but third season, it really took off. Like, oh, okay, I'll go watch it again. And then discovered it was good.
Taggart is described as one of the bus drivers, but he's also one of the bus drivers that we encounter that doesn't... He survives the episode. He's literally only there on a phone call, but... and he really wanted to try and keep his CMO, and that gives the impression that captains have a lot of leeway in what they can do to keep staff that they want, at least among the bus driver part of the fleet.
And I mean, Picard also has some leeway to do that. It's just leeway number 1 is being on the Enterprise.
Yes.
Yeah, you get the impression that Starfleet is very decentralized in terms of a lot of this decision making.
Oh yeah.
Decentralized decision making combined with really, really good data management and reasonably good comms. It's a lot easier to coordinate with the personnel office than it is to actually get a person from where they are now to where they want them to be, right? So you can do all the paperwork stuff quite easily, but the actual moving of the body is hard and seems to be sort of decentralized.
Yeah.
No, unnatural selection was not the clone breeding one. The clone breeding one was Up the Long Ladder.
Up the Long Ladder, yeah.
Best skipped.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely best skipped. We come to one of the first, for me, I find really interesting other captains in TNG in the form of Donald Farley. He is our first Galaxy-class captain. And like Picard, he has an interest in archaeology. And this sort of brings to mind the possibility that Starfleet in the Galaxy class is looking at for captains that are going to be doing long-range exploration and science. And as a result, they're picking archaeology-focused captains who have the command experience, but also have the science experience and focus to really push toward being able to go and do the science mission. And yes, Yamato goes boom.
And it actually says something very interesting about Starfleet, that he can just sort of go off and do a port call, in effect, without actually, having orders to go do it. And it tells me that the way that they probably do this is that they have orders that say, here's your sector of space, just go around and do stuff in it.
Well, you kind of get the impression that Farley has gone a bit off the reservation when he goes out hunting the Iconians, because he's running into the Romulan neutral zone.
So I think that goes with the idea that he has sort of a region of space he's assigned, and maybe a few things to hit while he's there.
Yeah.
And it's like, on the other hand, follow any leads that sound interesting. At least with the Galaxy class, they get a mission like that. That's a very high level bullet point list. And Varley is going a bit. What's the quote from Master and Commander? I have exceeded the scope of my orders. I exceeded the scope of my orders when we passed Brazil.
Yeah, and the thing about and I was thinking in terms of the Royal Navy in the 1800s, 1700s, and 1800s, because that's really kind of how that works, right? They're very pragmatic. They give them orders, but you could get a surprisingly long way with Captain, you exceeded your orders. Why did you do that? Well, it seemed like it was the right thing to do at the time.
Starfleet very much does seem to operate on that, and especially Varley is interesting because it suggests that, frankly, Varley is no further off the reservation than Picard gets sometimes. So it goes along with that line that Galaxy-class commanders may get even more latitude than most people because they pick people for Galaxy-class commands that they trust to go off the reservation, which goes back a little bit to the line I have that where's the flag for the flagship Enterprise, and it's Picard's.
Yes.
There's sometimes you have orders, sometimes you have guidance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the orders are, here's the box that we expect you to sort of stay in. And it's not that you can't go outside the box. It's that you have to have a presence inside the box. And go forth and do good work and tell us about it when you're done. And then everything else is guidance.
Right. Don't
start a war if you can avoid it.
Yeah. Wright has a point about doing a mission above top secret, which wouldn't be the first time we see someone in Star Trek with secret orders from the Admiralty.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't even be the first time we see someone have secret orders from the Admiralty and not read Picard in, because it happens in Ensign Rowe. And that's even on his ship. But we do.
Varley definitely has the authority to be hunting down stuff on the Iconians.
Yeah, and it does seem to be a little... He doesn't say to Picard... Frankly, if you're going to record a message that your ship's about to blow up and you've got top secret orders, that's a pretty good time to tell someone you've got top secret orders.
Yeah.
Right. Unless he thought that the orders were getting it copied over with the logs.
That's true.
Science fiction in general, the entire idea of top secret orders in science fiction in general is kind of wacky. And I always go back to Wing Commander for this one, where what's his name does the entire bit with giving him the ring to prove his authenticity, when he could have just said, I'm actually an admiral. And there wouldn't have been any of this trying to convince him to do it. He could, if there was ever a time, right? The Earth government is about to be, Earth is about to be destroyed. If there was ever a time to say, I think this is the time when they said that I could reveal it in an emergency. I think this is the time period that they were talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and reveal that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. But that movie is a guilty pleasure. There's so much stuff that's wrong with that movie, but I still watch it about once a year and enjoy it when I do.
It's kind of a dumb film, but yeah.
I got it out from Netflix back when they used to mail you DVDs. And it was my first and my only real exposure to directly interacting with the Wing Commander universe, and I really liked it. I was younger, and it probably doesn't hold up on a rewatch, but I dug what it was doing.
Well, it's a great example of a movie that, from a tactical perspective, and I don't mean like combat perspective, I mean from like a going through and looking at the minutia of the movie perspective, right? Looking at the actions of individual characters at any given time. None of it makes any sense, right? You've got people that are just making stupid decisions left and right. You've got none of the physics works. From that point of view, it doesn't hold together. But the big picture story is actually a pretty compelling. The elevator pitch for it is pretty compelling, right? So the bad guys have captured the navigation data necessary for them to get to Earth faster than we can get the defense fleet in place to prevent Earth from being slagged. So we give the orders to this particular admiral. You are to do what you have 2 assignments, and you are to do whatever you need to engage those assignments. You are to get us intel to tell us what we're going to deal with, what we have to deal with, and you're to slow those jokers down. And all we need is about 6 hours. So give me my 6 hours so that we can have a defense fleet in place. And then you add on to the idea that not only did they turn it from a, sorry, spoilers, everybody. I guess it's a little late in the conversation to say that. Not only do they turn it from you're able to get the blocking force in place, but they're able to actually turn the tables and bushwhack.
Yeah, Stephen Ross is saying yet another good example of the heroes being the only ship in the area. But that's the thing. It was a backwater. They thought they were way behind the lines. The lines have moved because they found a hole in the spatial geography of the universe.
Yeah.
They've moved the lines.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is they weren't the only ships in place, but those guys got blown up in the opening scene. Right?
Yeah.
It's like they're the only survivors in that sector of space.
Speaking of only survivors.
Yes.
Yes.
Great segue. That way. It's mirrored. My monitors are mirrored. It's throwing me off. We get Rachel Garrett, captain of the Enterprise C. We do not get much of her. But what we do get is we get a captain who very much understands, in a very Coast Guard kind of way, you have to go out. You do not have to come back. And even with having been time displaced, she immediately is like, okay, what can my ship bring to this fight? And there's not a whole lot she can bring to it in the present of yesterday's Enterprise, but she's still ready to do that anyway. And they're ready to go back in time if they think that's going to be it. If you go by the book Beta Canon, her previous first officer, who is not the one who dies before the events of yesterday's Enterprise, but the previous one, had been killed by a group of Klingon renegades, and yet she's still going out there and responding to the Klingon distress call. So it's the you have to go out, you don't have to come back. You have to go out and do the job. And all of the Enterprise captains are good. So
it's interesting because she's very much the equivalent in her era of a Picard or we talked about Harriman last episode and how maybe if your thought is John Harriman, what a schmuck, maybe you should revise that opinion, or maybe some points to consider with that opinion. And I think this is another example of seeing an Enterprise captain out of her element, but still in the game, which is interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things I think that's interesting about Garrett is that is like you said, that she's like, we're a ship, you know, before they realize that they can go back through the time portal, which does seem to take them a little while to come around to, given that people are bouncing in and out of time portals all the time. It's like, oh, you can go back, but that she's really like, we're here. This is kind of the war we were training for. I guess we're here for it. And it's a little interestingly like I guess like an 80s era Burke showing up half shot to pieces, and it's like, especially since we know that some ambassador class are still in service, it's very much like, if you were not battle damaged and we're upfit, we're refit, like we send you back to the rear areas, and in 3 months we get a really good ship out of it.
Yes.
But
a really good ship with a battle-hardened crew.
But today, maybe that's not true. And I think that's interesting about the difference in the rolling upgrade programs, and certainly have already fought one battle this week.
Yes. Chris, do you have anything on?
For some reason, that last comment reminded me of something from one of Tom Harlan's books, one of his science fiction novels, where they fight this big battle. And there's this scene where the CO of the ship is talking with the weapons officer. And she pulls the weapons officer up and says, okay, we fought this long battle and I'm exhausted. And I don't think we're done yet. I think this was only round one. I need to get some sleep to be ready for round two. Are you awake enough to be the officer in charge while I get some sleep? And can your group get by without you? And she says, yeah, I've got enough schlitz left in me I can do a 6-hour watch. And my leading chief petty officer is fantastic. My senior chief is great. He's got the department running like a well-oiled machine. I'm pretty superfluous down there. So, ma'am, yeah, go sleep. I'll do that for you.
And and Garrett has a crew that can really sort of pull together.
Yeah. And this is one of those things that you don't really think about in all of this, is that it's really all about the CO, right? The CO is in charge. The CO is fighting the ship. The CO is one of the big vulnerabilities, is that if you can just keep throwing stuff at the CO so they never get time to sleep, then that's a big deal.
I mean, that's certainly one of the things, we got to bring, certainly one of the things in the Pacific War, you talk about Midway. One of the things that was always striking for me reading Shattered Sword is talking about how Fletcher, I think, gives like his last orders. He's like, all right, well, that was a pretty good day. We're going to sail east so that they can't catch us in the dark. And here are my morning search orders, and have a good evening, everyone. 2 down, 3 down, 1 more tomorrow. Let's make it a good one. And meanwhile, meanwhile, back on the Japanese side, you have Yamato 1,000 miles away, desperately spending the entire evening awake, trying to figure out who's sunk and who's not. And of course, Nagumo floating around on trying to reassemble his force and go herring off for a night torpedo attack against an enemy who has decided he doesn't want to have a night torpedo attack inflicted upon him, and is very deliberately sailed the other way and will deal with this in the morning. He's in his out of office auto reply. And
and at Leyte Gulf. So Leyte Gulf is a fascinating battle to talk about, with the entire Taffy 3 and all the rest of it. And And it's really the chain of command was all jacked up, and I can give you a whole bunch of reasons why the person you should be blaming is Kincaid and not Halsey. But part of it was Halsey was asleep when his staff was making decisions for him, and because he had been up for like 36 hours. And so
Raymond, no, we're not actually talking about Axanar. We're talking about Starfleet captains in general. And World War II history is really good, but we're 40 minutes in and only about six and like halfway through. I'm sorry, Chris.
It'll be good. It'll be good. It just means you have to come back one more time.
Oh no, I already figured that.
Come back 2 more times instead of 1 more time. But yeah, you mentioned Shattered Sword, Rob. I'd love to have John Parshall on the show. The problem is he's really not a science fiction guy.
No.
John's a wonderful person. I always, whenever I go, when I go to Minneapolis, I will frequently have lunch with Chris Carlson, who's been on the show, John Parshall, and Pat, and we'll all get together for lunch. Mm-hmm. I introduced Pat to John and Chris because, as Andy Presby says it, my superpower is I introduce people to each other. I'd love to have John on the show, but he's not really a war gamer. He's not really a science fiction guy. So I'm not sure that he would be a good guest.
So
back to you.
Robert DeSoto of The Hood. We don't really... He's Riker's old XO. And Picard poached Riker. Or Riker is his old... He's Riker's old CO. Picard poached Riker from DeSoto. And he's a bus driver who knows he's a bus driver and is like, yeah, this is my job. But hey, I get to do something fun today. I get to go out and run out to the Enterprise. And he is, as noted, he is referenced in the Deep Space Nine episode Treachery, Faith, and the Great River. He is... the Hood makes an appearance. DeSoto does not. Or the Hood is there, but DeSoto isn't. So that's why he's dropped in here as opposed to earlier. And we don't really have a whole lot other than that. But it was in Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, it was really just sort of a callback to this previous captain, which was a nice little nugget.
Someone was asking about wasn't the Hood around in season 1. The Hood makes several appearances. I think it was on The Great Derelict. Someone was talking about the Hood and said, in the real world, a carrier is surrounded by a whole group of ships that help it do what it needs to do. And the Hood is around like 4 or 5 times kind of running errands for the Enterprise. Like it shows up to be the Enterprise's backup or to deliver someone or pick someone up from the Enterprise, like 4 or 5 times. It's clearly another ship in the same sector, and it may even be. Someone suggested its job may even be to sort of fetch and carry for the Enterprise to a certain degree.
Well, and in the alternate universe where it's a show about the Hood, the Enterprise is doing that job.
Yeah.
So anyway.
And as we go on, Maxwell. This is probably one of my, the most interesting. We're finally into season 4 of TNG, and we get to Captain Ben Maxwell, and it's like, oh yes, no, we've been at war on and off with the Cardassians for years. Even Picard had a skirmish with them where the Cardassians were chasing him down after he was sent to deliver peace overtures, and Maxwell is sort of the first point I come to when I'm talking about Starfleet not taking care of the mental health of their captains. Hood is left on the front lines after his wife and son are killed for months without taking a day off. And we don't have this sense that somebody pulled him off the line and put him through a psyche valve. He's just sort of left there. Now, maybe they didn't have the spare staff. Maybe his CMO didn't think they could pull him off, but we know the CMO didn't, and we know that he's fundamentally not in a good place. And he sort of stays there. We also, through Maxwell, knowing that we have Chief O'Brien, and we know that Chief O'Brien is a chief petty officer per the TNG episode family. Chief O'Brien was Maxwell's chief tactical officer on, I believe it was the Rutledge. This is a situation where you have a senior enlisted as the tactical officer on the ship. That's a pretty serious ability to delegate positional authority to non-coms that we don't see a lot of referenced again outside of a couple occasional references with O'Brien on Deep Space Nine, where you have a senior NCO ordering around officers.
There is precedence for this in the U.S. Navy. If you're the tactical action officer on board a ship, you can get a TAO letter, meaning that the captain of the ship authorizes you to sit in the chair and be the tactical action officer on a launch. You're not going to give it to a junior enlisted guy, but it's not unusual for a chief or senior chief or a master chief to be the TAO. I mean, it's a little unusual, but it's only a little unusual. Theoretically, the supply guy could be in that role, right? Suppo could do it, but it doesn't usually happen. But in theory, it's as long as the CO signs off on it, then it happens. And so I have heard of ships where chiefs were the TAO.
That is something I didn't know. But it also goes to the point of there being a whole lot of autonomy of delegating to positional authority in Starfleet. The other really, I think, absolutely important point to remember is Maxwell was right when he was going after the Cardassian ships. Picard believes Maxwell was right. The only reason that Picard doesn't follow through on what Maxwell was saying is because he's got a Cardassian on the bridge and he doesn't want to start a war. A war that allegedly has just wrapped up recently. And what I would kind of like to see is, you know what? I kind of want to see maybe a radio play of Maxwell's trial, Maxwell's court-martial, after he's been brought back. And either the letter from or the appearance of Picard at the trial explaining, no, Maxwell was right. He was absolutely right. He didn't do it the right way, and I had to bring him in to stop a war. But he absolutely had what was going on correct.
You have to wonder if they put him on a shelf for, this is, I think, season 3 or 4. You have to wonder if 4 or 5 years later, when the Dominion War comes back, he's very much more of a combat commander, I think. We see a genre that comes up a couple times, I think, in the subsequent slides of what I think of as like a combat commander. The guys whose ships appear much more focused on what phasers do than what the sensors do. He very much sees himself as a combat officer. And I'd love to know what his Dominion War record is.
Yeah.
Is he the chief of staff for some admiral the way Cisco was, or is he out the new ship and he's back out on the front lines, or what's he doing? It's an interesting question.
Or perhaps they say, this is not somebody we can trust to be out by himself.
I think that's the interesting.
Maybe he's running a ship in one of the defensive fleets.
Or or staff back on Earth, or maybe he is just having to sit on the bench and watch the war he was trying to get ready for happen without him.
I mean, that's what they tried to do to Picard in First Contact, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, one other thing about the entire chiefs and TAOs and stuff. On multiple occasions, I haven't actually seen a chief as a TAO. I've heard about it. I haven't actually seen it. I've seen multiple occasions where chiefs were watch officers, including there was I did a rim pack one year. There were 3 watch sections. One of them was a very experienced lieutenant who had been a Mustang. So he had like 10 years enlisted before he became an officer, with a relatively inexperienced chief. I saw a master chief and an ensign, and I saw a senior chief and I'm sorry, not an ensign, a JG, and a senior chief and a JG. And in both of the cases with the JGs, the officer was not the lead watch officer. The watch officer was the deputy, and the senior enlisted was the lead. So
Interesting.
In that case, it's all about experience.
Yeah. Donnie, absolutely. The actor plays it absolutely very well. Just it's very well acted. It's The Wounded is one of those really great season 4 episodes that really sort of established just how good TNG can be.
And Matthew Bracey, O'Brien wasn't booted from the bridge to be transporter chief. This is one of the things that's been surprising me on my TNG rewatches. O'Brien's in a lot more places than just the transporter room. If you're thinking of the O'Brien from the comics where he's just standing around the transporter room all day waiting for someone to need to beam down, he's pretty much any time LaForge is running a work group in engineering, O'Brien's with him. He's very much one of LaForge's top troubleshooters, and he's all over the engineering section. He's not just standing in the transporter room waiting for something.
He's in 40-some episodes of TNG.
And I get the distinct impression that the way I can't comprehend that somebody that on regular everyday ops, that you've got somebody just standing in the transporter room waiting.
Right.
Just like on a Navy ship, you don't have a bunch of guys just standing on the flight deck waiting in case a helicopter wanders by, right? What you have is a group of people that if they call flight quarters, they drop what they're doing and they go gear up and they go do that stuff. And they may be standing around if they know that they're going to be tasked, right? If they know that something's coming in, but the rest of the time they've got something else. So I suspect that the way this works is that for one of the transporter rooms, there's an engineering person who's the designated transporter chief of the watch. And he's doing other stuff, but his orders are don't get in the bowels of something that you can't get up and run away and go do the other job if you get the word to do it.
Yep.
That he's always 2 minutes away from being able to transport somebody. But if you need to be transported in a minute, you're probably SOL.
Or running the auto sequence. Anyway.
Yeah.
Captain Fraser. He has no reaction to it being the Enterprise without Kirk, which is a bit odd, seeing as he disappears between the motion picture and the Wrath of God. But it's still a crazy thing, and he's a Starfleet cap. It's maybe, if you go by what we see with Lower Decks, crazy stuff happens throughout the... Better? That feels better. Crazy stuff happens throughout the entire fleet. So maybe he's just used to crazy stuff. Crazy stuff having happened. We really don't know. it's a bit part at the end of a time loop episode. We really don't get a whole lot of information about him. But it was nice and fun to see. We come now to Edward Jellicoe. A lot of people have talked about Jellicoe. A lot of people have made a lot of comments about Jellicoe. There was a whole episode of the Joint Geeks of Staff podcast that talks about Jellicoe. He is the absolute closest thing we come to an outright military commander as a captain in Starfleet. He is sent there to whip the Enterprise into shape. How well he does, and the Joint Geeks of Staff gets into this, how well he does that by forcing his sort of new model onto the Enterprise, or should he be adapting the model of the Enterprise into a combat one, it's a question a lot of people have gone back and forth on, and I don't have an answer on it. He makes Troy wear a uniform, and let's be honest, that actress looks better in the uniform than the stupid jumpsuits she had on for the first part of TNG.
And she preferred to be in that type of costume rather than the other stuff too. It was more comfortable.
Yes.
I've seen those, for what it's worth, I've seen those uniforms up close because I went to Star Trek The Experience and did the behind the scenes tour. And those uniforms are made out of Lycra, which you may recall was really, really popular in the 1980s. The difference is Lycra, like aluminum foil, has a shiny side and a non-shiny side. And so they're wearing the shiny side in. So it's non-shiny Lycra, which meant it was very stretchy. But when I look at that quote there, the only thing in that quote that I don't understand, right off the top of my head, that I sort of scratch my head at, is that first part where they're apparently changing from a 3-watch rotation to a 4-watch rotation. And I'm not sure why he's, jumping right in and saying, let's switch to a 4-watch rotation. Although I do know, that's a very U.S. Navy thing to do. It's not that is totally not unusual for a new officer to come in and say, hey, by the way, I'm changing the watch rotation like immediately. And it's all because it's like, in my experience, I don't think that the 3-watch rotation works. I think the 4-watch rotation works better. And in some cases, they'll do stuff like I had this conversation with somebody where they went from a 3 to a 4. The thing is, if you're on a 3-watch rotation, it's like, okay, we got to let the guys go have time to eat. So you end up with the same number of people, but split into 3 groups. But at any given time, half of them are off running errands and doing this other stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was, okay, let's break it down into smaller groups. But when you're on watch, you're butt and chair on watch. You're not off doing this other stuff. I accidentally muted myself. That's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, is that in Star Trek, what you see is people are either on watch, as a general rule. What you see is people are either on watch, they're sitting in front of a console, pushing buttons, doing stuff, or they're like off playing the trombone or something, or hanging out in 10 forward or something because they're on their own time. In the U.S. Navy, you've got watch, you've got off time, which usually means sleeping or eating, and then you've got all the other parts of your job that you have to do that don't involve sitting in front of a console being ready to push a button and launch a missile. And that includes like all the maintenance stuff. It includes all the training stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on that isn't standing watch. So, but I really like the bit at the end where he says, do you prefer Will or William? Right?
Yeah, he's obviously he's done some lookup on the ship. He knows, because he goes through and he gives like the 2 or 3 liner description of Riker's career.
Yeah, and most of the stuff in that paragraph is him specifically, is in effect him saying, I need to get up to speed on this ship. You can only learn so much from a distance. I need to find out how we may be going into combat soon. Yeah. I need to know what this ship can do, what you can and can't do. and I need to know it now.
Yes, there's absolutely in his dialogue there is absolutely nothing that stands out as being bad. Everything fits with exactly what he's doing. He is coming into a situation and he is trying to impose his will directly onto it, and how that. And we're going to run just a little long here. I've got one more slide from TNG.
That's fine.
There's an interesting thing with the. It does remind me, talking about the lines of dialogue on the page. There's an interesting thing I'm reminded of. I think it's in the Cain Mutiny, which we talked about a bit last week. If you haven't gone and looked at it, with Commodore Matt Decker at the start of last episode, in the Cain Mutiny, which inspired the Doomsday Machine. In the Cain Mutiny, one of the things that comes up is in the court-martial at the end of the book. Slight spoiler alert for like a 40 or for like a 60 or 70-year-old novel. I guess like an 80-year-old novel, but anyway, there's the transcript of what happens on the bridge, and the crew are trying to explain why they decided to start ignoring the captain in the middle of a typhoon, and that the situation as it reads on the page in the courtroom transcript is very much not the way those same words sounded when they were being shouted over a typhoon in a ship that was about to go over on its side. So there is a bit about how it's said and where it's said, but he does seem to be pretty much running through the routine of taking command of a pretty serious piece of hardware and a crew that he's trying to learn. Is he changing too much too quickly? Is several episodes of entirely different podcasts.
I was going to say that it would also be interesting to see what he would do in a situation where he wasn't taking command in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
Right, because I mean, this is not an optimal way to do this, right? It basically boiled down to Enterprise is a ship there. They decided they want somebody that's a little bit more experienced to go and do this. And do I remember correctly that Riker had already turned down a promotion once or twice?
Yeah.
3 times.
Okay,
Yeah.
so if I'm Starfleet, I'm not looking at Will Riker and going, he's my man.
Which is kind of it's a whole weird thing, and that's another sort of will he, won't he?
Yeah.
Riker. And command positions, and that's a bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but that's a very interesting discussion that I would.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it's a fascinating little setup, right? So Starfleet probably doesn't trust Riker because they don't think that Riker has the self-confidence to do it. Otherwise, he wouldn't be. He's in as much said that he prefers to be the number 2 guy learning. They're in this crisis situation. It's like, all right, Jellicoe's available. We're going to teleport him in to the Federation flagship that is on the scene. Riker's not our guy, and he goes on board. Jellicoe goes on board, knowing that they're in the middle of a crisis, and and he's got to act fast to get up to speed because it could go south anytime. He doesn't have the luxury of sort of, hey, let's sort of get to know each other stuff.
Right.
I've been on board a ship that had a captain who had been on board for 1 week. Right. It was the first time he went to sea with this ship. It didn't play what I saw. Now, I wasn't in all the meetings, right? I just sort of saw some stuff that, we happened to be in the bridge at the same time, and I saw a few things. And he was way more subdued than Jellicoe was. But, he wasn't in the middle of a crisis. It wasn't about to turn into a shooting war.
Yeah.
And Captain Johnson had the ability to sort of stand back and sort of get to know his crew and et cetera, et cetera. Incidentally, let me tell a quick little story about that, because I was really impressed with Captain Johnson. At one point, we're doing the meeting they do each afternoon, or they're sort of talking about what they're going to do the next day, right? They're doing this meeting, and the captain, the George, the junior ensign, is going to be officer of the deck for the next day, right? So the ink is still wet on her SWO pin, on the letter authorizing her SWO pin, she's going to be officer of the deck for a morning underway replenishment, like a dawn underway replenishment, low light condition underway replenishment. Underway replenishments are hard. The captain says, Ensign, how many underway replenishments have you done? 7 or 8, sir. How many low light? This will be my first, sir. Turns to the navigator. Nav, how many underway replenishments you've done? More than I can count, sir. How many low light? 30-ish. All right, Nav, you've got the con for tomorrow. And then he turned back to the ensign. We're in the wardroom. All of his officers are there. He turned back to the ensign and said, Ensign, I want you to understand something. This isn't about your inability. This is about mine. I have not done an underway replenishment on a Ticonderoga class cruiser before. It's really bad practice for both of us to be learning our jobs at the same time. You'll get your chance.
Yeah.
And I liked this guy before that speech. And after that speech, I really liked this guy.
Wrapping up our exploration of TNG captains this week, we encounter Silva LaForge, Geordi's mom. She is absolutely trying to hook her son up with her chief engineer. She is missing, presumed lost. Now, the exploration on the Hera, she gets in because we don't actually see a dead body. Because we're not covering those where we have dead bodies. She's stated to have a predominantly Vulcan crew. I have my own opinions, Ross. Hey, it's covering my head. So we see about 1% of the Enterprise D and Voyager and crews on Deep Space Nine of being Vulcan. Which seems like it would be low if you have a lot of Vulcans in Starfleet. Well, then the solution to that probably becomes many, if not most, Vulcans are serving on predominantly Vulcan ships or entirely Vulcan ships, which we'll get to next time with Deep Space Nine. And that sort of just leads into that point, which I actually have a better exploration of when we do Captain Solok of the Taccumbra. Since we're gone a little over here, I think we can handle that exploration for a couple weeks if you don't.
That works. I will say that you see non-Starfleet Vulcan ships a lot more than you see non-Starfleet ships from other people. I've always got the distinct impression that the Vulcans sort of keep Starfleet at arm's length. And I mean, that was explicitly the case with Spock. Mm-hmm. There's always conversations about, I want to say that Surak says something like, well, why are you wasting your time with Starfleet? You could be, we've got ships. Why aren't you doing our thing? And his response is, this is where I need to be.
Spock was the first one through Starfleet Academy.
Okay.
You have an entire Vulcan crew on the Intrepid that die in TOS.
Yeah. And I think that may have been like a big chunk of the Vulcans in Starfleet.
Possible.
It could very well have been.
And the other thing that I seem to recall, and I can't point to where it is, but you get the impression, at least I get the impression, that what humans tend to make Starfleet a career. It sounds like Vulcans do it for a little while and then they go back.
Well, they've got a longer life to not make it a career out of. Tuvok and Spock may be weird exceptions there.
Yeah, I kind of get the impression I'm going to mix my metaphors horribly. Vulcans are Eldar, and they're following an aspect warrior path. They go off and they do the path of the such and such, the path of the Starfleet officer, and they go and do that for a certain period of time, and then they sort of go back to doing their thing.
Their path of the Starfleet officer may be a 40-year stint. Yeah. Like, oh, that's just his he's just like a really long adolescence.
Yeah, somebody pointed out the Vulcan Science Directorate. Yeah, I also get the impression there are Vulcan warships.
There is a Vulcan ship we see in Lower Decks.
Okay. There's this missing piece that I don't think we've ever had anything definitive on, but we seem to you can sort of infer that it's there by the fact that you're sort of seeing all the stuff around it. And I think that piece is that the Federation Charter allows for national navies if you want to have one.
Yeah.
And the Vulcans have chosen to continue to do that stuff.
It's really interesting to me that the Vulcans have... I can understand... I mean, if we want to make some of the classical stereotypes about the Tellarites, I can see why the Tellarites might have decided, nah. Certainly I can understand. But I think it's very interesting to me that if that's the case, one of the real interesting questions is, what's the Andorian Guard? What's the Andorian Home Guard like these days?
Yeah. Yeah, and
that would be something to see in Lower Decks.
Lower Decks having the Andorian Home Guard show up in the 24th century.
Yeah,
really
and
interesting.
Lower Decks absolutely ties into our national navies.
Oh, go ahead.
There was a the Planet of the Ren Fair players. They have a ship explicit, just things falling. They have their own starship that is very explicitly Parliament class. You get the impression that it's a very combat capable vessel as their royal yacht.
Now, how many do they have? Is that the one that they have, and it's the Thai Navy has an aircraft carrier? Or is that they have 6 of them, and this is the one that the Queen rides on when she's on business?
Yeah.
But
at some point, I started writing a bunch of notes down, which I haven't gotten back to, on the idea comparing the Federation and the Delian League from the time period before the Peloponnesian War. And because, you get the impression that you can either contribute money to the maintenance of Starfleet, or you can contribute ships. Some of the non-canon sources that we see, things like the old Fossil role-playing game, specifically talk about Andoran-produced ships have their own distinctive design feel, right? Yeah. Everything that we've seen has come out of Utopia Planitia or the San Francisco yards for the original show, right? It's all Sol System stuff. What does an Andoran-produced ship look like? Are they standardized across the Federation? Or is this one of those things where they sort of go the humans really seem to like building ships, so we're just going to let the humans build as many ships as they want, and they can sort of form the backbone of Starfleet, and they'll be the ones that produce the bulk of the ships. But the Andorans, the Vulcans clearly have their own thing. I suspect that as long as the Vulcans have their own thing, the Andorans are going to have their own thing too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So old Star Trek fanon, the Starfleet Museum has a great... If you're interested in Starfleet procurement fanon and Starfleet history, the Starfleet Museum is great for that.
Because it predates Enterprise, so it's a completely different development path.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
It's starfleetmuseum.org, if I remember correctly.
Starfleettacmuseum.org. Yep, those guys. It popped up and it's yep, I remember that. Lots of ships with spherical primary hulls.
Yes.
Which is cool. I like that.
Before we go, if Carlos Kasimi is still watching. You said you were Rob's number one fan. I'm curious which piece of fiction is your favorite.
Other than that, I think we've hit the end. This is so Silva LaForge has the honor of being the last captain we see in Next Gen that isn't in the main cast.
Yep.
So I think that brings us to the end of things for this evening.
Yeah, I printed out my slide deck this time.
Okay. All right.
And so we'll be jumping in next time in a couple weeks with Captain Kehoe of the Galaxy Class Odyssey.
Kira, you want to be on the show real quick? Kira?
Oh, that's fantastic.
I've seen her. She's a very good, very white, very fluffy dog.
Please give love for me. Please, Duffalo.
I love the echo effect.
Oh shit, I forgot that was on. I was all right.
Oh.
All right.
So we ran a little long tonight.
That's okay. But one, I've got one last question.
Certainly.
Now that you've had time to think about it, are you speaking for your employer?
No, I don't speak for myself.
Okay, good. All right. Just wanted to make sure because things can change. All right, everybody. So thank you very much for coming in and joining us on Starfleet Tactical. We are not doing this next week. Next week, not doing it because everybody and their brother is unavailable next week. Actually, I don't know if my brother is unavailable. He might be available, but Pat and I and Rob at a minimum and Lissa at a minimum are not available to continue this conversation. But we do plan on doing it the week after that.
2 weeks.
Yeah, so 2 weeks from tonight, which would be the 19th.
19th.
So it looks like we're going to do it on the 19th. And with that in mind, everybody, see you next week. Or 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
2 weeks.